Welcome, WND-TV viewers, to another edition of the Watchmen video blog. Vladimir Putin was recently voted Forbes magazine's most powerful person ahead of President Obama. It has seemed recently that Putin and Russia's star is on the rise. But my first guest says it's actually the opposite and that Russia is on the decline. Ilan Berman is vice president of the American Foreign Policy Council and author of a fascinating new book called Implosion: The End of Russia and What It Means for America. Here's our interview. Well, Ilan, welcome. Great to have you back. And I'll tell you, what a book. Implosion: The End of Russia and What It Means for America. And it's interesting, Ilan, such a timely book, because Vladimir Putin right now is being called by some as the most influential world leader on the heels of the Syria debacle with the Obama administration. Okay, so the popular narrative right now is Russia is growing in strength, but your book kind of takes a different tact. Tell us about it.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, if you look at what Putin is doing with regard to Syria, how he's brokering or has just brokered a deal, an interim deal on Iran, it looks for all the world like the Russians are eating our lunch in foreign policy terms. Sure. But the reality, you know, there's that old saying that if you have trouble at home, you go abroad. And it's very much what's happening with regard to the Russians. They're striding very big on the world stage, but at home they have serious systemic problems. Social problems, economic problems, demographic problems. Russia is on the
cusp. And the radical Islam problem.
No, exactly right. Yeah. The society is transforming. The society is shrinking, but it's also transforming. It's becoming more radicalized, more polarized. And so Russia is really on the cusp of a transformation that promises to be every bit as explosive, every bit as profound as what we saw a couple of decades ago when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah, and Ilan, it's fascinating because, and that's why your book is so important, Implosion, because the impression is the exact opposite. In my experience here in D.C. as well, people don't really see that the Russian bear is actually struggling right now. Talk a bit more about the demographic issues. The Muslim population in Russia is really growing. Even in Moscow, there are mosques in Moscow, large mosques being built, and really across the country. Talk about that a bit more.
Exactly right. Moscow has, today, 2.5 million Muslims. It has more Muslims than any other European capital except Istanbul. And so, I mean, most people don't understand that this is sort of this is the wave that the Russians are heading towards. This is sort of what's happening. So there's two things to unpack here. Russia, as a whole, is dying. Russia's losing about 450,000 people every year to death and emigration. There's a lot that goes into that. You know, they have a sky-high rate of abortion. They have a really low life expectancy. But all that decline isn't uniform. The Russian Slavic population is declining, but other minorities are doing comparatively well. And the minority that's doing the best are the Muslims, because they abort less, they drink less, they divorce less. And as a result, today, Russia has a population of 142 million people. And Muslims make up 16% of that.
And how about those Russian republics, Ilan, that surround Russia? Obviously, Chechnya, Dagestan. Is there a chance that these countries or these regions try to separate from Russia as a whole? We've had that already, the separatist movement.
Well, there's certainly that tug and pull. And what you've seen coming out of Moscow for the last decade and a half has been this really sort of a forceful, violent, bloody conflict to try to keep these regions as part of the Russian Federation. But more and more, they're creating their own separate identity. And the more Muslims there are in Russia, the more forceful that urge is going to be. So today, Muslims are 21 million, 16% of the population. But by the end of the decade, 1 in 5 Russians is going to be Muslim. And by the middle of the century, every other Russian could be. And that means that that problem that you talked about, which is localized in the region known as the North Caucasus now, is increasingly becoming a nationwide problem in Russia.
You know, it's fascinating because we hear so much about how the face of Europe is changing, the Islamization in Europe, but Russia, largest country, landmass in the world. Talk about also, and you get into this in the book, how Russia is trying to project power on the world stage once again, and in the Middle East in particular, have obviously helped Iran with its nuclear program. What's their thinking there?
Well, I think they're thinking, they have a number of things that they think about. Part of it is that demographic issue at home. 98% of Russia's own Muslims are Sunni, and yet for a long time Russia's been pursuing an exclusively Shiite policy in the Middle East. They support Shiite Iran, they support Alawite Syria, and as a result, this spring, the spiritual head of the Muslim Brotherhood, Yusuf Qaradawi, labeled Russia an enemy of Islam. So if you're sitting in the Kremlin and you have this demographic changeover happening, that's bad news. And so this type of activism that you see coming out of the Kremlin, engaging the Saudis, engaging the Egyptians, is very much opportunism. They see us leaving, they want to come in and step in, but it's also a matter of necessity. They're trying to message to the rest of the Muslim world so it doesn't come back and bite them.
What is Russia's Israel policy right now? It seems a little bit all over the place. Friendly to the Jewish state, or what's their game?
No, I think it's in flux. I think for the last several years, the Russians have been treading very softly with regard to Israel, in large part because of economic reasons. The Russians were really interested in Israel's offshore natural gas reserves, and they thought that they could woo their way into the heart of the Israeli population, because after all, a quarter of Israel's population is either directly Russian or of Russian descent. So they have a strong potential political base there. And yet what you saw was that the Israeli government, when they looked at Russia's outreach, they decided, you know what, this may not be a safe bet. We may not want to get in bed with the Russians. And as a result, the Russians have been systematically shut out of all these deals. And so now, especially as Putin turns to engage more with the Muslim world, they're beginning to take a more hardline stance, more of a cold shoulder towards Israel.
Yeah. And Ilan, tell us more about Vladimir Putin. He's a fascinating guy, to say the least. Tell us a little bit more about him and your research for this book, Implosion. You obviously researched Putin and what he's all about, his background. Who are we dealing with here?
Well, what's funny is that Putin, when we think about Putin, we tend to think about him in precisely the way he's tried to craft his image.
Yes.
Running around shirtless, wrestling tigers, harpooning whales, helping geese to migrate. It's all sounds a little bit ludicrous, kind of neat, but ludicrous.
Yeah, right.
And yet, he's dead serious. He is a product of the old Soviet system. He is a former high-ranking intelligence officer. He is a guy who believes very much in the reconstitution of Russian influence and also of the Russian Empire. Or Soviet Empire, neo-Soviet Empire.
Sure.
And so a few years ago, when he was giving a speech in Munich, he termed the collapse of the Soviet Union to be the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. That's right. I can think of a couple of others, frankly, but for him, that was the most important thing. And when you look at what he's doing now in the Middle East and in Europe and in the area that's known as the post-Soviet space, it's all about recreating influence. It's all about creating economic linkages, political linkages, where he can really throw his geopolitical weight around in a way Russia hasn't been able to do in a long time.
Yeah, and I think another fascinating thing about the book, Ilan, and talking about Putin and his moves, is the potential clash with China. Right now, Russia and China, kind of allies, I guess you would say. They line up on the same page on a lot of issues. Talk about the coming possible confrontation with China, in particular over the eastern half of Russia.
Right. So the viewers can understand, territorially, a third of Russia's territory lies in Asia. So there are places in Russia that are closer to Beijing than they ever are to Moscow or ever have been to Moscow. Where the problem comes in is that Russia's claim to international fame, its softwood lumber, its natural gas, its oil, is mostly in western Siberia and the Far East, in that area that, not all, but a lot of it sits right atop China. And the Russian population there is doing the same thing that it's doing everywhere else, and it's leaving or it's dying. Today, the Russian Far East is a territory of something like 4 million square miles. And the population density there is 6 Russians per square mile. It's less than Wyoming, right? So there's not going to be an outright military clash between Russia and China. It's not conceivable in that sense. But it is conceivable as a tug of war about political influence, because more and more you see the Russian state receding in the Far East and the Chinese state rising in terms of investment, in terms of political capital. And as a result, right now, Moscow and Beijing, they talk about cooperation. But in the future, it's going to be much more about competition.
Yeah. And you know, the Russian bear, wounded, as you lay out in eloquent fashion in the book Implosion, but still formidable. I mean, a massive nuclear arsenal, obviously. So, Ilan, if and when this all kind of plays out and Russia does implode, how does it affect us here in America?
Well, I think that's very much an open question. I certainly don't have all the answers. But in writing the book, I wanted to be very clear that, first of all, you need to go behind the headlines, behind this image that Putin has carefully constructed of a position of strength, because the way to get to a real, solid, strategic policy towards Russia is to understand the things that are going to start pulling it apart. We're very far from that now. We tend to approach Russia just the way Russia wants to be seen, as a bear that is strong and as a bear that's getting stronger. But in fact, the challenge from Russia in the future isn't going to be from its strength. It's going to be from its weakness.
Yeah. Folks, this is a very important, very timely book. It's called Implosion, The End of Russia and What It Means for America. Pick it up. Ilan Berman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.